Welcome to the mysterious casebook. Tonight, we step into Miss Marple's quiet yet watchful world, a murder beneath the clock, Coldharbour Square, where every chime hides a secret and every whisper echoes guilt. Pour yourself something warm and let the mystery begin. It was one of those early spring mornings in St. Mary Mead when the air seemed newly washed, and even the hedgerows had the shy, bright look of things freshly scrubbed. The church bell had just struck 10, and the village square was alive with a mild bustle of post-office chatter, bicycle wheels humming, the baker's van making its sleepy circuit. Everything appeared in its right place, perfectly aligned as though the world itself had just been dusted and set straight. Yet at the very center of this domestic picture, the clock above Coldharbour Square stood oddly still, its long hand caught between the 11 and the 12, hesitating in the faint sunlight like a thought that refused to complete itself. Mrs. Price Ridley, who noticed such things with relish, was the first to remark on it. 11:15 for nearly half an hour, she observed crisply to the chemist's boy, whose only crime was to be passing within earshot. One can hardly expect a respectable village to function properly if time itself goes wandering. The boy mumbled agreement and hurried away, but Mrs. Price Ridley's words hung in the air, drawing attention like dust motes in a sunbeam. Soon, the matter of the clock became a conversational current flowing through the shops and tea rooms, not because anyone truly cared about the mechanism, but because St. Mary Mead had long trained itself to detect significance in trifles. And as Miss Hartnell later said, it was just like the beginning of one of those dreadful stories, something ordinary, out of place. Miss Marple, seated by her window with her knitting and a pot of pink geraniums, heard the talk drift by in fragments. The clock. Yes, something wrong with the clock. She smiled faintly, for she had often found that time misbehaving was the herald of worse confusions. A stopped clock in a village, she mused, was rarely the only thing out of order. By noon, the square had drawn a small congregation of the curious. The blacksmith's apprentice claimed to have seen the verger climb the tower the night before. The vicar's maid insisted no one had, for she'd been watching from her window while polishing the brass candlesticks. Each testimony contradicted the next with cheerful conviction. And amid this growing muddle, Constable Reeves arrived, dutifully scratching his head and declaring that the clock would be seen directly. It might have ended a day's amusement to be forgotten by tea-time if not for what followed. When the clock was at last opened that afternoon, its pendulum arrested in mid-swing, something else was found lodged just behind it, a small folded scrap of fabric, pale and stained in one corner with a dark, rusted bloom. The verger, a poor, nervous man, nearly dropped his spanner when he saw it. He thought, for an instant, it might be part of a pigeon's wing. It was not. By 3:00, the square had emptied of spectators and filled with speculation instead. Mrs. Bantry was heard to declare that blood-stains in clocks were highly unchristian, while Miss Weatherby, in the tone of one who enjoys being alarmed, reminded everyone that the churchyard gate had been left ajar since Sunday. The vicar attempted reason, but was gently ignored. A faint unease rippled through the parish, the sort that does not yet fear the worst, but quietly expects it. In her drawing-room, Miss Marple stirred her tea, eyes fixed not on her cup, but on the geranium reflected in it. "Blood is rarely where one first finds it," she murmured, half to herself. She had seen many things in her long years in St. Mary Mead: misunderstandings, wickedness wrapped in propriety, the slow corrosion of envy, and though she felt no certainty yet, she sensed the alignment of familiar shadows. That evening, as the sunset bled faintly across the village roofs, the stopped clock still glimmered above Coldharbour Square, a silent face caught between minutes. Below it, the lamplighter hesitated, glancing up once before striking his match. It was at that same instant that the door of the church was opened by the verger, and his cry echoed out, thin and strangled, across the cobblestones. Within minutes, the square filled again, not with idle curiosity this time, but with that breathless confusion that only tragedy can summon. The body of a man lay at the foot of the clock tower steps, his hat a few feet away, his hand still clutching a torn fragment of the same pale fabric found inside the clock. Miss Marple arrived quietly, summoned by instinct more than message. She stood beside the vicar, her eyes calm, her voice almost tender as she observed the scene. "I believe," she said softly, "that our poor clock was trying to tell us the time of death, only no one was listening." The lamplighter's flame flickered uncertainly, casting wavering light over the cobblestones, as though even the village itself hesitated to admit what had begun. The sound of the verger's cry had scarcely faded before the square began to fill, once more this time with the cautious, craning shapes of neighbours drawn by dread and curiosity in equal measure. Evening light spread over the cobbles, soft and gold at first, then deepening into the bruised hues of dusk. The lamplighter, whose hand still trembled, dropped his matchbox into the gutter. Mrs. Price Ridley was already stationed at her window, spectacles glittering like accusation. Inspector Craddock's arrival brought an illusion of order. He came briskly from the road by the vicarage, his coat collar turned up against the wind, his expression already arranging itself into one of professional composure. He glanced briefly at Miss Marple, offering a courteous nod he knew, from previous experience, that she would notice what others dismissed. But for the moment, he turned to the verger, who stood wringing his hands near the church door, pale as parchment. "You'd best tell me exactly what you found," Craddock said. His tone was practical, neither harsh nor indulgent. The verger swallowed. "I came to lock up, sir, as I always do before supper. Only the west door was half open, though I swear I shut it myself earlier. I stepped inside, and then I saw Mr. Clement, the clockmaker, just there at the bottom of the steps. I thought at first he'd fallen, but when I touched his shoulder, his voice broke off into a shudder, cold as stone. "Mr. Clement?" Miss Marple murmured softly, her gaze lingering on the still figure. "How very curious." It was indeed Mr. Basil Clement, a name that within minutes would ripple across every drawing-room in St. Mary Mead. He had been the village's clock repairer for nearly 20 years, a quiet, conscientious man with a taste for precision and solitude. He lived alone in a neat cottage on Coldharbour Lane, where the curtains were always exact in their symmetry and the geraniums aligned in perfect rows. Few could claim intimacy with him, fewer still had ever seen him lose his temper. Yet the torn fabric in his hand and the faint trace of blood upon his collar hinted that something had shattered that calm order. As the body was respectfully covered, Miss Marple watched the faces around her with serene attentiveness. It was not the dead who revealed secrets, she often thought, but the living. Mrs. Bantry, wide-eyed and animated, whispered to Colonel Melchett that Clement had once spoken rather sharply to the choir boys about their noise. Miss Hartnell recalled seeing him walking toward the church at twilight, looking peculiar. The vicar's wife murmured something about a sad accident, though her tone betrayed disbelief. And through it all, a tremor of relief threaded the voices, the quiet satisfaction of those who, though shocked, were not themselves suspected. Craddock straightened from his inspection and gestured toward the clock tower. "We'll have to check the mechanism again. Might tell us when this happened." The constable nodded and began his ascent, boots echoing hollowly within the stone. Miss Marple followed the sound with her eyes, thoughtful. She noted the clock's hands, still frozen, that small pause between minutes as though the very machinery had recoiled at witnessing what had been done. Later, as dusk deepened into full night, the square emptied save for a few lingering figures. Miss Marple walked home at a measured pace, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. The air smelled faintly of rain. She passed the vicarage gate, where Mrs. Price Ridley's voice was audible through an open window. A dreadful thing, though perhaps not wholly unexpected. Precision men are often repressed, and repression, as I always say, leads to the most unfortunate impulses. Miss Marple smiled to herself, not at the sentiment, but at its symmetry. How quickly a tragedy turned into moral instruction in St. Mary Mead. Inside every respectable opinion lay the seed of something defensive. Appearances were fragile currency here, and the death of Mr. Clement was already being exchanged for gossip, sympathy, and the quiet pleasure of knowing one's own life remained orderly. At home, she lit her lamp and settled by the window again. From her chair, she could see the square's clock face glimmering faintly in the dark, still motionless, still bearing silent witness. She reflected that Mr. Clement, who had spent his life measuring time, might now be judged by it. The tear in the fabric, the smear of blood, the unlocked door, small things, yet each suggested motive rather than accident. In Miss Marple's experience, such neat arrangements were rarely coincidental. Human beings seldom achieve symmetry without intent. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was the vicar, looking troubled but faintly exhilarated in that way the clergy sometimes did when calamity proved the frailty of human nature. "My dear Miss Marple," he said, "I thought you might have heard. They've taken the body to the vestry for now. Inspector Craddock seems to think it was murder." Miss Marple nodded gently. "It has that unfortunate look, yes." The vicar sighed. "Terrible business, and so near Easter too. I cannot help but wonder what on earth brought poor Clement to the church at that hour." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. "Perhaps," she said, "something that could not keep a good time." He blinked, uncertain of her meaning, and took his leave with murmured gratitude for her composure. When the door closed, Miss Marple remained motionless, listening to the rain beginning at last upon the panes with a soft, persistent rhythm, like seconds counting down to another revelation. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing toward the square. The clock, half visible through the mist, had not yet moved, but something in the stillness felt newly deliberate, as though the village itself were holding its breath, waiting for the next sound to break the hour. The rain did not last long, a brief silvery veil that left the cobbles shining under the street lamps. By morning, the air smelled of damp stone and the faint sweetness of newly turned earth. Constable Reeves had already been up and down the square twice, his boots squeaking and his notebook damp at the edges. Inspector Craddock stood near the clock tower, looking distinctly as though he had slept little. The clock itself had been stopped entirely now, its pendulum removed and sent to the police station for examination, though what one was meant to deduce from brass weight, no one seemed certain. Miss Marple appeared just after 8, small and unhurried in her grey shawl and straw hat. She might have been out for her morning constitutional, save for the measured curiosity in her eyes. "Good morning, Inspector," she said as if discussing a garden hedge rather than a murder. Craddock looked up, managing a faint smile. "Morning, Miss Marple. I suppose you've already heard the talk?" "One cannot help hearing," she replied mildly. "I sometimes think St. Mary Mead might communicate perfectly well without telephones. The air itself carries rumour." He gave a quiet laugh, but then sobered. "It's a puzzler, this one. No sign of a struggle, no clear motive. Clement wasn't a man to make enemies, from what I can tell." Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the church steps where the body had lain. "No man makes enemies deliberately, Inspector. Sometimes one simply collects them the way a clock collects dust, until something stops it altogether." Craddock considered that. "We've been to his cottage. Everything tidy as a pin. But one thing was odd. His mantel clock had been taken apart, every gear laid out on a white cloth. It looked deliberate, but unfinished, as if he'd been called away. Or interrupted, Miss Marple said softly. Her eyes brightened a fraction. Precision minds dislike interruption. Reeves approached with a notebook, clearing his throat. "Sir, the verger's here again. Says he remembered something." The man was ushered forward, his hat clutched like a talisman. "It's only this, sir," he said anxiously. "When I passed the square around 10 last night, the church lights were off, but I thought I heard the clock strike once. Just once. Odd, because it shouldn't have. And then a sort of clatter, as if someone had dropped a tool." "Thank you," said Craddock. "We'll note it." He glanced toward the tower with renewed interest, while Miss Marple's expression remained unreadable. As the morning wore on, the square resumed its semblance of order. The grocer swept his step, and the post-mistress arranged her window display. Mrs. Price Ridley took up position again at her curtain. Yet beneath the polite rhythms of the day, something in the village seemed subtly awry. People spoke too quickly, smiled too tightly, as though the stopped clock had been thrown off more than an hour. It had dislocated their sense of safety. Miss Marple paused outside the bakery, where Mrs. Bantry and Miss Hartnell were already deep in debate. "I always said he was peculiar," Miss Hartnell announced, in the tone of one vindicated by tragedy. "Too quiet by half and always measuring things. People who count seconds are rarely at peace." "Nonsense," said Mrs. Bantry cheerfully. "He was just particular. My husband says that a man can't mind clocks all day without going a bit mechanical himself." "Still," Miss Hartnell insisted, "it isn't natural, living alone with nothing but ticking for company." Miss Marple accepted her bread roll and smiled faintly. "I dare say some people find comfort in measured sounds," she murmured. "There are far worse noises to live with." The remark passed unnoticed, but as she walked away, her mind lingered on the small details of gossip often overlooked. Mr. Clement's solitude, yes, but also his precision, his half-finished clock, the fabric torn and clutched in death. The pattern of a man who cherished control, suddenly invaded by disorder. It was not hatred she sensed at the core of it, but disruption, as if some force had tampered with the delicate balance of his routine. That afternoon, Craddock came by Miss Marple's cottage, notebook in hand. "We've discovered something new," he said, "a woman's glove. Silk, found in the church porch, tucked behind the umbrella stand." Miss Marple raised her eyebrows. "Left or right?" "Right." "Stained near the wrist, possibly with oil from the clock gears." "How very suggestive," she said. "One wonders what sort of lady mislays such an accessory? Or who wanted it to be found?" Craddock replied grimly. "We're making inquiries. Mrs. Price Ridley's already volunteered her opinion that it belongs to Miss Weatherby, though I suspect she'd accuse the Queen herself if it proved convenient." Miss Marple's eyes glinted. "Accusation is a kind of entertainment here, Inspector. It tells one more about the accuser than the accused." He chuckled. "I see, I'll have to tread carefully." "You always do," she said, smiling, though sometimes the truth lies where people are least anxious to look. When he had gone, the cottage felt oddly still. The afternoon sunlight slanted across the carpet, catching the tiny motion of the clock on Miss Marple's mantel, the one she kept 5 minutes fast to test her maid's punctuality. It ticked faithfully, a small, steady heart against the quiet. Yet even that seemed faintly ominous now, as though each second were marking off the distance between knowledge and illusion. Outside, the square was empty again. The hands of the great clock still pointed to the moment of its stopping, 11:14, like the frozen pause in a sentence no one yet dared to finish. Miss Marple gazed at it a long while, then turned away, a faint furrow between her brows. Some connections, she knew, required patience to surface, like faces slowly emerging from old photographs when held to the light. And in the hush that followed, the faint chime of another clock, distant, uncertain, seemed to echo from the vicarage lane, as though the village itself were whispering an unfinished answer. The echo of that distant chime seemed still to hang in the air when Inspector Craddock returned to the square the next morning, his mood sharpened by the weight of unfinished facts. He had spent a restless night cross-examining his own notes, convinced there must be some hidden logic binding glove, clock and corpse together. Yet all he had were fragments, orderly, disconnected, like the workings of a clock dismantled too soon. The village, meanwhile, had made up its mind. It usually did before evidence could be consulted. By breakfast, Mrs. Price Ridley was informing anyone within earshot that everyone knew Miss Weatherby had been seen leaving the church porch late that night, her shawl drawn tightly and her expression odd, most odd. The story gained embroidery with each telling, until by mid-morning Miss Weatherby's supposed flight had taken on the melodrama of an elopement thwarted by fate. Miss Weatherby herself, when approached by Craddock, appeared more bewildered than guilty. She was a woman of 45, delicate, prettily faded, and given to a romantic melancholy that the village tolerated with gentle mockery. Her cottage on the high street was lined with books no one else read, and flowers that never quite thrived. "Yes, Inspector," she said, when asked about the glove, "it could be mine. I lost one several days ago, though I can't imagine how it came to be at the church. I did walk there on Tuesday evening for the quiet, not for service, but I assure you I never went near the tower." Her voice trembled slightly. "I liked to hear the clock strike. It was comforting somehow. Mr. Clement used to say a well-kept clock was like a conscience, always reminding one when one has stopped." Craddock regarded her with courteous gravity. "And you knew Mr. Clement well?" "Hardly at all. He was exacting. I'd once asked him to mend a small carriage clock. He returned it with a note explaining that sentiment was no substitute for regular maintenance." Her smile was brief, almost wistful. A moralist disguised as a mechanic, I thought. Miss Marple, who had been permitted to sit quietly in the corner of the room, knitted with mild industry. "Some moralists," she said gently, "are more easily disguised than others." Miss Weatherby blinked, uncertain whether this was sympathy or warning. Craddock closed his notebook. "Thank you, Miss Weatherby. That will do for now." Outside, the air was chill and grey. The church clock, though still silent, seemed to dominate the square with an odd vigilance. Craddock exhaled and turned to Miss Marple. "You don't think she did it?" Miss Marple's eyes were thoughtful. "No, Inspector, but I think she believes she might have a different and sometimes more dangerous condition." He frowned. "What do you mean?" "She feels guilt for something she did not do," Miss Marple said softly. "It gives her a reason to behave like a suspect. One sees it in village life all the time, people who apologize for misfortunes entirely beyond them." Craddock pocketed his notes. "If she didn't do it, someone wants us to think she did." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, yes. And the best way to suggest that is to leave behind something as personal as a glove." They walked together toward the square, the ground damp from a light drizzle. At the corner near the post office, Mrs. Bantry intercepted them, face aglow with the thrill of proximity to scandal. "Inspector, I dare say you've heard. Young George Purley swears he saw lights moving in the tower again last night after you'd locked everything. He's a sensible boy, not given to fancy." Craddock thanked her and moved on, though the remark lingered. Miss Marple, however, had stopped, her gaze tracing the Isa tower's outline against the dull sky. "A conscience and a clock," she murmured. "Both need winding, or they fall silent." Later that afternoon, Craddock interviewed George Purley at the blacksmith's yard. The boy, earnest and red-cheeked, described seeing a faint yellow glow behind the clock face near midnight. "Just for a minute, sir. Then it went dark again. I thought maybe the mechanism caught the lamplight, but it was higher up, more like a lantern." The inspector's pencil stilled. "Could anyone have reached that height?" "Only with the inside ladder, sir. Mr. Clement had the key." When Craddock repeated this to Miss Marple over tea, she stirred her cup once before answering. "Keys are curious things," she said. "So often they're copied, yet people behave as if each were unique. It gives them comfort. You see the illusion that they alone can open what's closed." He leaned back, studying her. "You think someone else had a key?" "I think," she said, eyes mild, "that whoever did this understood Mr. Clement's habits well enough to know he would go alone, and late. Such understanding suggests familiarity or long observation." Outside, the village clock remained dark and motionless, its blank face reflecting the faint gleam of rain. Somewhere beyond the square, a dog barked once, then fell silent, as though warning and acceptance had merged in the same breath. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "I wonder," she said, "whether the sound young Pearlie heard was truly the clock striking, or something made to seem so." Her tone was calm, almost abstract, but her gaze drifted toward the vicarage, where a light had just appeared behind the curtains. Inspector Craddock followed her glance, thoughtful. "The vicar?" "Not necessarily," she said. "But in every small community, there's always someone who feels entitled to control the rhythm of others' lives. Sometimes it's done from duty, sometimes from fear. The difference, I find, is subtle." The clock tower loomed in the deepening dusk, its silence growing heavier with each passing minute. Craddock made a note to revisit the vicar in the morning. Miss Marple did not. She already knew the sound of unease when it began to tick. Evening had drawn its soft veil over St. Mary Mead, the sky a dim lavender fading into pewter. The clock tower stood outlined against it, solemn and mute, as if guarding its own secret. From the vicarage, faint light leaked through the curtains, a single square of gold trembling in the mist. Miss Marple's gaze lingered there a moment longer before she resumed her knitting, her needles clicking softly like a metronome against the silence. Every stitch, she thought, was a small defiance against chaos, a gesture of order in a world that insisted on unraveling. Inspector Craddock arrived promptly at 9 the next morning, his expression one of professional irritation balanced with genuine curiosity. "He wasn't pleased to see me," he said, accepting a cup of tea from Miss Marple. "The Reverend Goodwin claimed the whole matter was spiritually unwholesome and begged me not to bring the shadow of sin into the sanctuary." Miss Marple poured the tea with delicate precision. "I dare say he meant well. Clergymen are often uneasy when evil presents itself too close to home. They prefer it in parables." "He was evasive," Craddock continued. "Admitted he'd been in the vestry around 10, writing notes for Sunday service, but said he heard nothing unusual. No mention of lights, no mention of Mr. Clement. Yet one of the choir boys swears he saw him leave the church at 10:30. Miss Marple looked up mildly. "Did the boy say from which door?" "The north side." "How curious," she murmured. "The vestry door opens west." Craddock frowned. "You think he's lying?" "Not lying, perhaps protecting something." "There's a difference, Inspector. People lie to conceal guilt. They protect to preserve appearances." The phrase lingered in the air, faintly ironic as Miss Marple rose and crossed to her writing desk. From its drawer, she drew a folded slip of paper, worn at the edges. "I took the liberty of walking near the tower this morning," she said. "The verger let me inside out of kindness. I found this wedged behind the stair rail, likely fallen during the commotion." Craddock took the paper, opening it carefully. It was a half-torn receipt from a jeweler in Melchester, dated 3 days earlier, made out to B. Clement, cleaning and repair of gold pocket watch. Below it, faintly penciled, was a note in another hand. "To be collected Thursday evening urgently." Craddock's brow furrowed. Thursday evening, the night he died. "Indeed," Miss Marple said. "Though I wonder why Mr. Clement, who prided himself on punctuality, would wait until nearly 11 to retrieve such a thing." The inspector examined the paper again. Perhaps he meant to meet someone there, someone who didn't wish to be seen visiting his cottage. Miss Marple's smile was gentle, almost approving. "Yes, that is possible. Some appointments, Inspector, are better kept where time cannot overhear them." He pocketed the receipt, already planning the journey to Melchester. Yet even as he left, unease pressed upon him. The image of the stopped clock, of Clement's still hand clutching the fabric scrap, returned with insistent symbolism as though every clue echoed another, waiting to align. By midday, gossip had resumed its industrious rhythm. The postmistress reported that a stranger, a tall man in a dark coat, had been seen near the church earlier that week. Mrs. Bantry swore she recognized him as that rather superior gentleman who came about insurance policies. Miss Hartnell countered that it was the same fellow who'd tried to sell her encyclopedias. Both agreed his shoes had been too shiny for honesty. Miss Marple listened quietly from her seat near the counter, her expression one of mild interest, though her thoughts were elsewhere. A stranger provided a convenient diversion. Villagers preferred their wickedness imported. It made the parish feel safe. But Miss Marple had seen enough of human nature to know that most evil was domestic. It grew where manners forbade inspection. That afternoon she walked again to the square. The air was crisp, the cobbles still faintly slick from the night's rain. Children were playing hopscotch near the baker's step, their chalked numbers pale against the stones. The innocence of it pleased her, yet she could not ignore the numbered squares, measured jumps, a game about order played in a world that had lost it. At the foot of the clock tower, the verger was polishing the brass plaque with dutiful fervor. "We're to reopen the church for evensong tomorrow," he said nervously. "The inspector says there's no harm now." Miss Marple looked up at the clock face. Its hands, newly reset, pointed precisely to 2. "How reassuring," she murmured, though one wonders if the hour can ever quite catch up again. Her eyes drifted downward, noting a faint scratch along the lower stone step, deliberate, as if made by something metallic dragged under weight. Kneeling delicately, she traced it with a gloved finger. "You've been moving the lectern, perhaps?" she asked lightly. The verger blinked. "No, ma'am. Its heavy oak hasn't been shifted in years." "Ah." She straightened, brushing off her skirt. "Then I suppose it must have been something else." When she returned home, she set her knitting aside and placed the small flake of metal she'd quietly pocketed onto her table, a bent pin, tarnished at the tip with a smudge of oil. Nothing remarkable, except that it smelled faintly of clock grease. She regarded it for a long moment, as though listening to its silence. The clock on her mantel ticked with infuriating regularity, yet Miss Marple felt a subtle imbalance in the rhythm, a missed beat hidden among the steady ones. Somewhere, she thought, there was another rhythm at work entirely, one of concealment and conscience, wound tight and waiting. The rain began again, soft against the glass, and in its sound she fancied she heard the echo of another ticking, faint, deliberate, and human. The rain's whisper lingered through the night, blurring the edges of the village into a hush of grey and silver. By morning, the square had the faintly guilty look of a place recovering from confession. The clock ticked again with obedient precision, its hands moving as if nothing dreadful had ever interrupted them. Yet beneath that measured calm, tension flickered in glances, in conversations that halted too quickly, in the soft weight of things unsaid. Inspector Craddock returned from Melchester looking weary but thoughtful. He found Miss Marple tending her geraniums by the window, her shawl pinned neatly, her face turned toward the mist. The jeweler confirmed it, he said without preamble. Clement collected his watch that evening about 9:30. Paid in cash. Nothing unusual, except he wasn't alone. Miss Marple turned slightly, her eyes alert but serene. "Oh?" The jeweler described a woman waiting outside. He thought she was in morning dress, black coat, hat with a veil. Clement seemed agitated and kept checking the street before leaving. The woman followed him at a distance. "How very interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "Mourning has its practical uses. It allows one to hide in plain sight, grief being the most respectable of masks." Craddock nodded grimly. "We've tried to trace her, but no luck yet." And another thing, that gold pocket watch wasn't Clement's own. It was engraved inside 2LH, with gratitude and affection. LH, Miss Marple repeated softly. Not Mr. Clement's initials at all. Exactly. The jeweler said it was old work, perhaps 20 years. He assumed Clement was repairing it for someone else. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused mid-air. Or returning it, she said. For a moment, only the sound of the clock on her mantel filled the room steady, untroubled, like a conscience that had already made peace with its lies. By late afternoon, Craddock had resumed his interviews, but it was Miss Marple who received the visit that mattered. The Reverend Goodwin called, his face pale and drawn. He removed his hat with trembling hands and sat stiffly on the edge of her chair. "I'm afraid I owe you an apology, Miss Marple. I wasn't entirely frank yesterday." She folded her hands in her lap. "People rarely are, Reverend. Truth, like humility, seldom arrives fully dressed." He managed a faint smile. "Quite so. The fact is, Mr. Clement came to see me on Wednesday evening. He was troubled and said he'd been entrusted with something he didn't wish to keep. I thought it was merely a parish quarrel, some sentimental trifle, but he mentioned a woman's name. Miss Lydia Hartnell." Miss Marple looked up, her expression placid, but her tone feather-light. "Miss Hartnell? How very unexpected." "Yes, he said she'd given him something to safeguard, something valuable. He wouldn't say what. Only that he was uneasy. I urged him to speak plainly, but he left, saying he'd set things right before morning. That was the last I saw of him." Miss Marple's gaze rested briefly on the clock above her mantel. The phrase is interesting, "set things right." One might easily mistake moral repair for mechanical. Goodwin sighed. "You think I should have pressed him further?" "I think," she said gently, "that people only reveal what they believe you are capable of understanding. Mr. Clement, being precise, would have preferred a confidant who shared his method, not his faith." The Reverend flushed, uncertain whether he'd been reproved or absolved. "Then you believe Lydia Hartnell?" "I believe," Miss Marple interrupted softly, "that Miss Hartnell is a woman of habits, and habits, like timepieces, can be relied upon to betray their owners." That evening, Miss Marple took her customary walk toward the high street. The lamps burned faintly, through the drizzle. As she passed Miss Hartnell's gate, she noticed the curtains drawn tighter than usual, no gap for the evening light to escape. A curious thing for one so fond of supervision, she thought. Through the glass, she glimpsed a movement, the silhouette of a woman pacing, head bowed, hands clasped. Then the light snapped out. The next morning brought fresh disturbance. The verger, red-faced and panting, knocked on Miss Marple's door before breakfast. "Beg pardon, ma'am, but the church key's gone missing. I keep it in the vestry drawer, and it's not there." "Nor the spare." "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "Then I suppose the church will remain locked for the moment." An hour later, Inspector Craddock arrived with news that deepened the riddle. "We've just found the missing watch, hidden behind the hymnals in the vestry cupboard. No fingerprints. The chain's broken, clean through." Miss Marple's eyes brightened with a faint sadness. "Objects often outlive the hands that wound them, Inspector. One wonders which broke first, the chain, or the trust that bound it." Craddock looked grim. "It places the scene squarely in the church. Whoever hid that watch was there after the murder." "Or before," Miss Marple said quietly. "Conscience, as you see, can be anticipatory." He exhaled sharply. "Miss Hartnell's name keeps cropping up. The Reverend, the glove, now this. Appearances have a dreadful fondness for cooperation," she murmured. "It's their favorite form of deceit." Outside, the church clock struck 5. The first chime it had given in days, the sound carried through the mist, pure and oddly final. Miss Marple listened until the echo faded, her expression unreadable. Then she turned toward the square, her eyes narrowing slightly as though she had just noticed something everyone else had chosen not to see. A faint tremor of unease rippled through Miss Marple's face as the last echo of the clock's chime faded into the damp air. She had been standing by her garden gate, the grey mist thickening about her shoulders, when a hurried step broke the silence. It was Inspector Craddock, hat askew, coat unbuttoned, his expression carrying the peculiar alertness of a man summoned unexpectedly by consequence. "Another disturbance?" he said tersely. "Miss Hartnell's maid found her door open at dawn. She's gone." Miss Marple did not look surprised. "Gone?" she repeated softly, as if testing the word's moral resonance. An interesting form of silence. "She left no note," Craddock went on. "Her bed unslept in, her handbag missing. A neighbor saw a woman walking toward the station road before the first light. Dark coat, small case in hand. Could have been her." Miss Marple drew her shawl closer. "And the station master?" "Nothing yet. I've sent word ahead to Melchester. We'll know soon enough whether she boarded a train." They walked together toward the square, the air heavy with drizzle. The clock loomed above them, its face pale against the clouds, as though washed clean of guilt. Below it, Constable Reeves stood beside the church gate, speaking in low tones with the verger. Both men fell silent when Miss Marple approached out of respect, or perhaps discomfort. For in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple's presence at any scene was rarely accidental. Inside the vestry, the air retained a faint metallic scent. The cupboard where the watch had been hidden now stood open, hymnals stacked neatly as though the disturbance had been nothing more than a misplaced key. Yet on the stone floor near the lectern, Craddock noticed a small darker patch. Not blood, but oil, smeared into an irregular shape. He crouched beside it. "Clock grease again," he muttered. "Same as on the glove." Miss Marple's voice came gently from behind him. "So many stains, Inspector, yet they all pretend to be the same." She bent, her gaze drifting toward the brass candlestick on the altar. "Has anyone checked the candles?" Craddock blinked. "Candles?" "Yes," she said, straightening. "They are like timepieces, in their way measured, deliberate, slowly consumed. If one burns too long or too little, it tells you something about the hour." He turned, following her line of sight. One of the tall white tapers had melted nearly to its base, while the other stood scarcely touched. He frowned. "You think she was here, then? After evensong?" Miss Marple did not answer at once. "I think someone was someone who wanted the darkness to seem longer than it was." Outside, a church bell tolled once for the morning service, but its sound seemed oddly displaced, as if echoing from another distance. Villagers had begun to gather again, Mrs. Bantry, her curiosity bright as ever, and Mrs. Price Ridley, stiff with the righteousness of the scandalized. Their murmurs drifted through the open door like wind through reeds. "She's fled, of course," Mrs. Price Ridley declared to anyone listening. "Guilt never waits for justice, only for trains." Miss Marple regarded her with mild reproach. "Not everyone who runs is escaping, my dear. Some are merely hurrying toward the truth before it closes." As the word closes, Craddock's eyes lifted instinctively to the clock face above. It ticked on, untroubled, yet its very steadiness now seemed cruel, a reminder that time moved forward even as the village circled the same small mysteries. By noon, word came from Melchester. No ticket purchased in Miss Hartnell's name, no woman matching her description seen on the platform. It was as if she had walked into the fog and dissolved. That afternoon, the vicar came to Miss Marple's cottage, pale and agitated. "They're saying dreadful things," he began, voice quivering. "That Miss Hartnell confessed something to me about money. It's nonsense, I assure you. She merely came to discuss the parish accounts." Miss Marple listened patiently, her eyes resting on his trembling hands. And did she bring anything with her, Reverend? Papers, perhaps? He hesitated. A small tin box, I believe. She said it contained old receipts from the Restoration Fund. She left with it or said she would. I haven't seen it since. Miss Marple's gaze softened. People often confuse receipts with confessions, especially when both are written in their own hand. The vicar looked bewildered, as though she'd spoken in riddles. He made his excuses and hurried away, leaving the faint scent of damp wool and anxiety behind him. Miss Marple rose and drew the curtains aside. The square lay hushed beneath the overcast sky. Each shop front reflected faintly in the puddles an image of order masking distortion. She thought again of the oil smear, the uneven candles, the vanished woman, and the watch inscribed to LH. It formed no solution yet, only a pattern, something delicate and deliberate, like embroidery half unpicked. As evening came, a knock rattled her door. It was Constable Reeves, breathless. "They've found something, ma'am," he said. "At the edge of the wood near the station road. A handbag, black leather, half buried in leaves." "Whose?" "We think of Miss Hartnell's. Inside just this." He opened his palm to reveal a small golden key, bright against the mud. "Looks like a clock key." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her eyes deepened with thought. "Then, perhaps," she said softly, "it wasn't only the clock that needed winding." The constable looked puzzled, but she said no more. She stood at the window long after he'd gone, watching the tower through the drifting fog. The clock's hands glinted faintly in the lamplight, marking time with serene indifference, and somewhere beneath that calm face, a secret ticked on, waiting for its hour. The lamplight trembled faintly across Miss Marple's lace curtains as she stood by the window, her thoughts turning with quiet precision. The little golden key lay on the table before her, gleaming softly, an object so slight, yet weighted with implication. Somewhere within the village, it would fit a lock long undisturbed. She had seen enough of human nature to know that people rarely conceal things entirely out of malice more often. It is fear of losing the little order they possess, and St. Mary Mead, for all its flower shows and church bazaars, was a village terrified of disorder. A gentle knock interrupted her reflection. Inspector Craddock entered, his hat in his hand, his face drawn from fatigue rather than failure. "The bag's been confirmed as Miss Hartnell's," he said. "No money, no papers, just the key," which she hid before vanishing, Miss Marple murmured. "Curious, isn't it, that she should bury what she meant to keep safe and flee without it?" Craddock sat opposite her, rubbing his brow. If it's connected to Clement's death, she must have panicked. "Panic," Miss Marple said gently, "is rarely solitary, Inspector. It is often encouraged, sometimes even orchestrated." He gave her a searching look. "You believe someone frightened her?" "I believe," she replied. "Someone let her see just enough of the truth to think herself guilty." The idea lingered in the air between them, fragile yet unsettling. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the evening was unnaturally still, the kind of silence that waits to be broken by revelation. Miss Marple rose and took her shawl. "If you would indulge me, Inspector, I would like to see the vestry once more." 10 minutes later, they stood again beneath the cold arches of the church. The candles had been replaced, their light steady and even. The great clock above them ticked faintly through the stone like a heart muffled by distance. Miss Marple moved slowly, her eyes tracing each familiar surface, her manner serene but intent. "Do you notice," she said at length, "how very clean everything is? Every trace of the previous night's commotion wiped away. Even the oil spot has been scrubbed." Craddock nodded. The verger did it. Said he couldn't bear to see the place looking defiled. "Ah," Miss Marple said softly, a word chosen by conscience, not cleanliness. She crossed to the cupboard and touched the door, noting how the wood stuck slightly against its frame. "It is freshly polished," she murmured, "yet the hinges are stiff. Odd, isn't it, that only some parts of the church should receive such attention?" "Do you think he's hiding something?" Craddock asked. "I think," she said mildly, "he's hiding the wrong thing." The verger himself appeared moments later, startled to find them there. "Oh, good evening, ma'am, Inspector. I was just locking up again." His hands, she noted, were chapped and raw, as though from recent scrubbing. "I was admiring your diligence," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "The place looks quite restored." He flushed. "Well, one must keep up appearances, miss. Can't have folk thinking the Lord's house has gone to ruin." "Appearances are indeed important," she said, her tone mild, but her eyes clear, "even when they conceal the truth." The man's gaze flickered uneasily. "Beg pardon, ma'am." "Nothing at all," she said gently. "Only that cleanliness, like timekeeping, requires precision, and Mr. Clement, I imagine, was quite precise." Craddock watched her, understanding dawning by degrees. She turned away before he could speak, moving toward the clock tower steps. "May I see the mechanism once more?" she asked. The verger hesitated, then produced his key-ring with visible reluctance. "If you like, ma'am, though I've had enough of that cursed thing to last me." The small iron door groaned open. The interior smelled faintly of oil and dust. Miss Marple climbed halfway up, paused, and ran her finger along the ledge where the pendulum housing met the wall. It came away grey with soot and something else, a faint glint of gold dust. She descended carefully. "Tell me, Mr. Reeves," she asked the constable waiting below, "was there ever a time when this clock was gilt?" He shrugged. "Not in my day, ma'am." "Then this powder must be newer than the clock," she said softly. "Perhaps from another gilded object recently handled near it." Craddock stared at her, realization flickering. "The watch?" She inclined her head, but her expression remained serene, or rather, what the watch concealed. Before he could question further, a sharp knock echoed from the outer door. The verger went to answer, and a drenched figure stumbled in Miss Weatherby, her coat soaked, her hair unpinned, eyes wide with something between terror and relief. "I've come," she gasped, "because I can't bear it any longer. They'll say I killed him, but I didn't. He said he'd help me. He said no one would ever know." Miss Marple crossed to her gently. "No one ever does at first," she said. "But truth has a way of keeping time, my dear, even when the clock is stopped." Miss Weatherby's hands trembled. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I only wanted," her voice faltered, her gaze shifting upward toward the ticking above. Miss Marple's eyes followed hers, and for the briefest instant, something moved within the clock housing a shadow where none should be. Craddock turned sharply, motioning Reeves toward the steps. "Stay back," he ordered. Miss Marple, however, did not move. Her voice was soft, but it carried through the nave. "I think, Inspector, that whoever has wound the clock tonight means to stop it again." A low creak shivered through the tower as the constable's boots struck the narrow iron steps. The air grew taut, filled with the mingled scents of metal, wax, and fear. Miss Weatherby stood motionless by the vestry door, one gloved hand pressed against her mouth, as though to stifle the words that might condemn her. Craddock's torchlight swept upward through the shadows, catching the gleam of brass and the faint movement above. Then came a muffled exclamation, a struggle of sound, not violent, but desperate, like the noise of someone trying to preserve silence at any cost. Miss Marple moved forward at a pace, her voice calm, almost tender. "Please, Inspector, the light is not too bright. One mustn't startle whoever's up there." A moment later, Reeves descended, supporting the trembling figure of the verger. His face was pallid, his hair damp with sweat. In his right hand, he clutched a length of winding key, the great iron one used for the clock's mechanism. His gaze darted from Craddock to Miss Marple, then to Miss Weatherby, whose eyes filled with tears at the sight of him. "I wasn't," he began hoarsely. "It's not what you think." Craddock's voice was steady but cold. "Then why, Mr. Prowse, were you hiding inside the clock tower at night?" The verger sagged against the rail, his composure unraveling. "Because I couldn't bear it any longer. The noise of it ticking wouldn't stop. I thought if I could make it quiet again." Miss Marple watched him with gentle sympathy. "A guilty mind, Mr. Prowse, often confuses sound with conscience. The one echoes the other." He looked up sharply, startled by the accuracy of her tone. "I didn't kill him, Miss Marple. I swear it. I only helped hide what was left. For the Reverend's sake." Craddock's head snapped around. "The Reverend Goodwin." Prowse wrung his hands. "Not as you think, sir. Not murder. Only the watch. The Reverend begged me to put it away, saying it would cause misunderstanding if the police found it. Said it belonged to a lady in the parish. That's all." Miss Weatherby let out a faint cry. "It was mine," she whispered. "He gave it to me years ago, long before his wife died. I'd asked Mr. Clement to repair it, to keep it secret, but he threatened to return it publicly unless I made a full confession to the vicar. He said sin kept poor time, and I was afraid." Miss Marple's knitting hands rested quietly on the back of a pew. "So you sought counsel, and the Reverend, in his zeal, sought concealment." Craddock paced slowly, the facts colliding like gears out of rhythm. "If Clement meant to expose the affair, that gives him motive and perhaps her reason to silence him." Miss Marple shook her head slightly. "No, Inspector, that would require passion, and Miss Weatherby's heart has been subdued for years. Fear, yes, but not rage." The verger's breath came quickly. "He fell, I tell you." "He fell down the steps. The Reverend said it was Providence. We were to say nothing, just tidy what remained. I only took the cloth to cover his face." Craddock's expression darkened. "So there was a cover-up after all." Miss Marple's voice cut through gently. "Not quite. A cover-up requires agreement. I rather think Mr. Clement's death uncovered something everyone had agreed to ignore." Her eyes drifted upward to the clock face, its hands poised in perfect symmetry. "That watch, the one engraved to L.H., was not a love token, Inspector. It was a gift of gratitude for silence." Craddock frowned. "You mean hush money?" "Not quite so vulgar," she said softly. "More a tribute to shared discretion. The initials stand for Lydia Hartnell, the Reverend's late wife. A woman, I imagine, accustomed to preserving her husband's reputation." Miss Weatherby turned pale. "Then he used my secret to protect his own?" Miss Marple did not answer. Instead, she moved closer to the verger, who stared at her as though she could see straight through the cracked varnish of his conscience. "Mr. Prowse, you were winding the clock tonight. Why?" He hesitated. "Because it had stopped again. I thought if I could make it right, things would be right again." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured. "A very human error. One can't repair moral machinery with mechanical tools." Craddock gestured to Reeves to escort the man outside, but Miss Marple raised a hand. "Let him be for now. The clock still has one turn left to give." When they were alone, she faced Craddock quietly. "You see, Inspector, the village always fears scandal more than sin. The Reverend wished to protect his name, the verger his conscience, Miss Weatherby her past, and poor Mr. Clement he wished only for order. Such wishes rarely harmonize." The wind stirred faintly through the stained glass windows, making the candle flames lean toward the altar. Craddock looked up at the flicker, unease shadowing his features. "If what you say is true, Miss Marple, we're no nearer knowing who pushed him." Her gaze lingered on the tower steps. "Oh, but we are nearer, Inspector. The difficulty lies in understanding who thought it wasn't a push." He stared at her, baffled, but she only smiled that mild, knowing smile that could make a confession without uttering a word. The church bell struck the half-hour, its tone clear, metallic, precise. Miss Marple listened to it fade, her expression thoughtful, her eyes soft with something perilously close to pity. The last vibration of the half-hour bell still trembled in the rafters when Miss Marple moved toward the vestry door, her step unhurried, her mind as measured as the ticking above. Outside, the square lay draped in thin mist, lamps glowing dimly through it like watchful eyes. Inspector Craddock followed, his notebook unopened, his instincts torn between irritation and respect. He knew that Miss Marple, once silent, was never still. They paused beneath the clock tower. The verger had been taken home, the constable sent to fetch the reverend. Miss Weatherby sat on the low stone wall, pale and exhausted, the remnants of her composure arranged with touching futility. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on her only briefly before rising to the clock face itself, where the faintest flicker of a movement reflected the lamplight, a pendulum swinging against its own conscience. "It seems to me," Miss Marple said softly, "that everyone here has been adjusting the time to suit their peace of mind." Craddock gave a tired laugh. "You speak as though truth could be set by a dial." "Oh, but it can," she murmured. "The trick is knowing whose hands have wound it." They waited in silence until the Reverend arrived. He came without haste, hat in hand, his expression calm, too calm, Miss Marple thought, for a man whose parish stood on the edge of disgrace. When Craddock confronted him with the verger's confession, the Reverend's eyes flickered only once, then steadied into mild sorrow. "I asked Prowse to keep silent, yes," he admitted, "but only to spare Miss Weatherby unnecessary scandal. I knew nothing of violence." "And yet," Craddock said, "you knew about the watch and its inscription." The Reverend's lips tightened. "It was my late wife's. She lent it, years ago, to a friend who had fallen on hard times. I saw no harm in its passing hands again." Miss Marple regarded him over her folded gloves. "A generous arrangement, though generosity can sometimes disguise accounting. I wonder, Reverend, did Mr. Clement discover the true nature of that gift?" He stiffened. "You imply he meant to blackmail me." The man was precise, but not malicious. "Precision can be cruel when directed toward hypocrisy," she said gently. "You see, Mr. Clement's idea of righteousness was mechanical, to put everything in order, no matter who it embarrassed. When he threatened to reveal Miss Weatherby's indiscretion, you realized he would not stop there." The Reverend's composure thinned to transparency. "You suggest I suggest nothing," she interrupted softly. "But I do wonder why the clock struck once and only once at the hour of his death." Craddock looked up, startled. "Once?" "Miss Marple told me that earlier," Reeves said from the shadows. Verger swore he heard it. Miss Marple nodded. A single chime, like an interruption, as though someone had tested the mechanism midway. That would require access to the weight chamber and rather strong hands. The Reverend's voice sharpened. "Are you accusing a servant of tampering with the church's property?" "Oh, no," she said kindly. "Servants rarely tamper with their tidy. It's the respectable who alter things." A faint smile touched her lips as she crossed to the base of the tower. "You see, the real clue isn't in the time, but in the sound. Mr. Clement fell, yes, but not by accident. The clock struck because someone engaged the lever that winds the hammer. It startled him. He turned and slipped." Craddock frowned. "So the killer didn't mean to kill?" "Quite possibly," she replied. But then panic turned the accident into concealment. The watch was hidden, the fabric torn to make a false trail. The Reverend's conscience demanded a tidy scene, and tidy it became. The silence that followed was thin, brittle, and absolute. Even Miss Weatherby, fragile as she was, seemed to understand the mercy in Miss Marple's phrasing that truth could be stated without accusation. But the Reverend's shoulders sagged, the pretense of sanctity melting into fatigue. "I meant only to frighten him," he said at last, his voice barely audible. "To remind him that sin does not belong solely to the poor." He stumbled. It was so quick, like a man tripping over his own virtue. Miss Marple inclined her head. Morality can be slippery, Reverend, especially when one tries to polish it. Craddock exhaled slowly, the weight of the procedure returning. He signaled to Reeves, but Miss Marple raised a hand once more. "Not yet, Inspector. Let him sit. St. Mary Mead requires its confessions to be whispered, not paraded." The Reverend sank onto the stone bench, face hidden in his hands. The clock above gave a soft, deliberate click, its next minute engaged, indifferent to sorrow. Miss Marple's eyes lifted to it, and for a moment she seemed almost moved. "It is the most merciful of instruments," she said quietly. "It forgets as it goes." Craddock stood beside her, his tone subdued. "You always manage to pity them, don't you?" "I find it the only thing worth managing," she replied. A faint wind passed through the square, stirring the lamplight and scattering a few damp petals from the flower beds. Miss Marple gathered her shawl closer, feeling the chill settle. The clock struck again, this time a full, measured tone, neither sharp nor broken. Its echo rolled across the roofs like a benediction offered too late. And in that sound, Miss Marple heard the village begin, very quietly, to lie to itself again. The bell's echo dwindled through the fog until it seemed only a vibration in the air, a memory pretending to be sound. Miss Marple remained still beneath the tower, the shawl drawn close around her shoulders, her expression unreadable save for the faintest sadness about the eyes. The square was emptying now, the villagers retreating to their parlours, carrying with them the comfort of explanations. By morning, they would have rewritten the story, how the Reverend, in a fit of misguided piety, had caused poor Mr. Clement's accident, how Miss Weatherby's distress was merely a lady's weakness, and how Miss Marple, with uncanny intuition, had somehow known it all along. St. Mary Mead would dine on the narrative like cream. Inspector Craddock lingered beside her, his hat pulled low against the mist. "It's strange," he said quietly, "how quickly they forgive once the right person is blamed." Miss Marple gave a small, tired smile. "Forgiveness in a village, Inspector, is merely another form of forgetting. They cannot bear loose threads. They must weave tragedy back into pattern before supper." The Reverend had been taken gently away, not handcuffed, but guided, a gesture of discretion Miss Marple had insisted upon. Miss Weatherby had gone with Mrs. Bantry, trembling but curiously relieved, as though her long years of hidden guilt had been lifted by another's sin. Only the clock remained to witness, its steady rhythm restored, its pendulum marking seconds with tranquil hypocrisy. They walked slowly toward the vicarage, where the lamps glowed faintly through lace curtains. Inside, the scent of old books and extinguished candles hung in the air. Miss Marple paused before the hearth, where a small brass cross stood upon the mantel, newly polished, its surface gleaming too brightly for comfort. "Human beings," she said softly, "are much like clocks. They cannot bear to stop, even when running wrongly. So they adjust a little forward here, a little back there, until the lie feels like the truth again." Craddock watched her, uneasy. "You sound as though you pity him." "Oh, I do," she replied, lowering herself into a chair. "He was not a bad man, merely one who mistook order for virtue. It's a common failing, especially among those who believe themselves moral custodians. But righteousness pursued mechanically," she added, glancing toward the mantel clock, "can grind the heart to dust." Craddock remained silent for a moment, then said, "Still, it's manslaughter, Miss Marple. He'll have to stand trial." She nodded, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Her eyes had settled on a framed photograph above the piano of the late Mrs. Goodwin, a placid woman with the restrained smile of one who had learned to survive appearances. "His wife," she murmured. "She kept his secrets while she lived, and he kept hers after. A curious form of balance." Craddock followed her gaze. "You think she knew about the affair?" "I think she knew about everything," Miss Marple said gently. "But knowledge, in such marriages, is rarely active. It's folded away, like a handkerchief in a pocket always near, never used. She rose, crossing to the writing desk where a stack of parish correspondence lay unsorted. Her fingers brushed lightly over an envelope, half-sealed and forgotten, addressed to the bishop's office. On its corner, a faint smudge of oil marred the paper clock grease unmistakably. She glanced at it only once, then set it neatly aside. "You'll find," she said, "that most crimes begin with small untidinesses. Someone fails to clean what should be cleaned or cleans what should not. It's a moral housekeeping issue, really." Craddock gave a wry laugh. "You make murder sound like bad domestic management." "In essence, it is," she said serenely. "One untidy act begets another. A misplaced letter, a guilty silence, a secret too heavy to fold away. Before long, the household collapses under its own civility." They stepped outside again into the damp night. The mist had thinned and faint stars trembled above the square. The clock struck the quarter, clear and punctual, as though eager to demonstrate its innocence. Miss Marple stopped beneath it, tilting her head slightly. "Do you hear how even it sounds now, Inspector?" He nodded. "Steady as your conscience. Or as your denial," she murmured. "It depends who's listening." They walked back toward her cottage in companionable silence, the rhythm of their steps keeping time with the clock's distant beat. When they reached her gate, Craddock hesitated. "I'll be off then," he said. "There'll be papers, of course, statements, reports, the usual. But I rather think the village will prefer to forget it all quietly." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "They always do. Scandal ages poorly here, like milk in summer." He smiled faintly, tipping his hat. "Good night, Miss Marple." "And thank you." She inclined her head. "Good night, Inspector. Do be careful not to wind your watch too tight. One must allow a little give, or the spring will break." When he had gone, she entered her cottage, the lamplight falling gently over her knitting chair, her teapot, her book left open on the table. Everything was as it should be, though she paused before the mantel to regard her own small clock. It ticked steadily, perhaps a second fast. She reached out and adjusted it with the lightest touch, just enough to bring it back to harmony. From the window she could see the square still, composed, its ordinary life creeping quietly back into place. The bakery lamp burned, the milk cart rattled past, and the gossip already began to soften into sympathy. The machinery of respectability had resumed its proper rhythm. Soon, no one would speak of Mr. Clement, or the Reverend, or even Miss Weatherby's trembling confession. The clock would continue to keep perfect time, and St. Mary Mead would once more believe itself innocent. Miss Marple returned to her chair, pouring a little milk into her tea. For a moment, she listened to the house breathe around her. The faint creak of floorboards, the rustle of wind at the eaves, the heartbeat of her mantel clock marking the minutes between memory and acceptance. "It's never the wickedness that shocks one," she murmured softly to herself. "It's the tidiness afterward." Her knitting needles clicked gently, steady as penance as she began a new row in the dim light. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, the night answering with silence. Miss Marple looked up once more toward the square, where the tower rose like a monument to the village's fragile peace. The clock gleamed faintly under the moon, serene, untroubled, and entirely unaware that it had measured out both a death and its forgiveness.